Okay, so today I'm going to try and explain to you how we write a write an account type question in your GCSE paper. So this is a question which comes up in this module, the Cold War. It also comes up in another one of our modules, our thematic study, Power and the People. So it'll be really useful for you to really get this in your head, because then you can replicate the same structure in both papers. Okay, it's worth 8 marks. And if you follow what I say, closely, it's quite easy to get between 6 and 8 out of 8, which is what we need for those kind of grade 7s to grade 9s. Now, to answer this question, normally for an 8-mark question, we're looking for 2 paragraphs. Now, I think the best structure for this particular question is to write 3 short paragraphs, so you can really hit that idea of each part of this journey. Write an account is basically asking you to kind of narrate what happens. Now, we need to be wary that we stay analytic rather than just being narrative and thinking it's a storytelling, because it's not telling a story. But if you follow this structure of causes, events, and outcomes, you can kind of hit the narrative and get all the details in of what happens, while also kind of retaining some analysis as you go through it. So it's very simple. What is something? How was it caused? What happens? And what were the outcomes of that? You don't have to think about why it's important. You don't have to think about, comparing it to anything else. It's just literally write an account of this event. So as an example, if you were asked to write an account of the Marshall Plan, 3 paragraphs. Paragraph 1, what caused the Marshall Plan? Paragraph 2, what happened in the Marshall Plan? Paragraph 3, what were the consequences of the Marshall Plan? And it really is that simple, okay? So I'm going to go through in a moment just detailing those evidence points, what you'd actually include at each stage, but it's helpful now for you to start thinking for yourself, right, if I had to bullet point 2 or 3 things for each of these paragraphs, what am I thinking of? So what caused it? What happens? What were the consequences? Okay, so we're trying to kind of really detail out our plan here and get it really, really cemented with details, specific knowledge, so we can really get those higher marks. So what caused the Marshall Plan? Well, you can think about the creation of the Iron Curtain. You can think about the US policy of ending isolationism, that idea of they're no longer going to purely focus on themselves. They're going to involve themselves in the events of Europe. And finally, what we might call the trigger cause, the Truman Doctrine, that kind of stated that idea of containment and that commitment to containment. So it was all these 3 things which really caused the Marshall Plan to come into effect. Paragraph 2, what happened? Well, you need to talk about the fact $17 billion is given to countries who need help to regenerate after war. You could talk about how, Marshall went to Europe and saw that countries that fell into poverty were more susceptible to communism, and that this was a plan to try and regenerate countries rather than allowing that to happen. And then you should give some examples. So you can give some specific numbers that are given to each of these countries if you want. You can get them from the textbook, from your notes, or you could do an example such as the one I've put here. There were nets for Flemish fishermen. They kind of wanted to rebuild the French industry. Finally, in terms of consequences, well, what was the consequences? What were the outcomes of the Marshall Plan? Well, we know Stalin saw it as dollar imperialism. We know it led to the creation of Comcon and Cominform, which really kind of reached a point in the Cold War. We have 2 defined sides. We have the capitalist side, people that accepted Marshall aid. We have the communist side, people that don't accept Marshall aid and instead joined Comcon. Right, that example I just ran through is a very straightforward example of this type of question. Write an account of one specific event. Now, that's not to say that won't happen, but there is also every chance that the exam board are going to overcomplicate it slightly and maybe make the question a bit more wordy to try and throw you off. So I've now changed the question. I've put in red where I've changed it to really highlight it to you. But instead of just saying write an account of the Marshall Plan, I'm asking you to write an account of how the Marshall Plan caused tension between superpowers between 1947 and 1949. Now, this question isn't really a whole lot different. The only thing it's changing is it's giving you a defined time period, and you do need to stick to that. So you now know your dates and you don't want to go out of those dates. There's no point talking about, the creation of the Warsaw Pact, because that happens in 1955. That's not in our dates. So you're sticking to the dates, And it's also telling you it wants an emphasis on how the Marshall Plan caused tension. Okay, so rather than simply saying how the Marshall Plan was caused, you need to explain to me how the causes of the Marshall Plan caused tension. So you still go through those same things, but you just need to interweave a couple of sentences along the way, linking sentences as we did last week, about how they cause tension. You know, Stalin's attitude to the Eastern Europe and his behavior in terms of leaving the Red Army in certain nations caused tension because it worried and brought paranoia and fear to Truman about the spreading of communism, you know, the idea of the Marxist doctrine spreading, and it led him to create the Truman Doctrine and his commitment to containment. Okay, so you're kind of linking things together to show why one thing leads to another and why everything builds up tension, because we're going to concentrate on answering our question. So I've just written out a plan for you there, exactly the same, apart from rather than just thinking of what were the events, what were the outcomes, what were the causes, you have to think what were the causes and how did they cause tension? What were the events and how did they cause tension? What were the outcomes and how did they cause tension? Okay, so it's just slightly more complicated. Right, the last thing I've done to try and help you through this is I've just written a short bit of an example, okay? Now I haven't filled in all the gaps here, but I've done most of it. So hopefully if I just take you through this example, it will kind of help you really see what I'm expecting you to do here. So the Marshall Plan was caused because, remember, paragraph 1 is going to be on the causes and how the causes cause tension. The Marshall Plan was caused by the developing situation in Europe by 1947. So then again, my dates. I've reflected the fact I've read the question. In my opening line, I've got Marshall Plan, I've got 1947, and I've got cause. At the end of the war, many countries in Eastern Europe turned to communism, whether through duress, that means kind of force, or by their own choice. For example, Poland, ... Now, that would be where I'd want you to tell me how Poland turned communist. And that shows me you have a really high level of specific knowledge. And in my head, I'm thinking tick, 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 high grade boundary up into the level 4 category, 6 to 8 marks, okay? That's the kind of knowledge we want to see. Now's the moment I go back to that causing tension element. I could have left it. And if my question was just why was the Marshall Plan, write an account of the Marshall Plan, I could now move on and go into the next one. But no, I need to write why it caused tension. So this caused tension because President Truman and the USA were fearful of the spread of this spread, and it led them to announce the Truman Doctrine, which arguably sparked the Marshall Plan. Okay, so do you see that even in that short example of paragraph 1, I have included some specific knowledge, I've included 2 of the main causes, and I've told you how one links to the other and how both of them cause tension. Now, I think for this example, we need a couple more sentences here to explain the Truman Doctrine, to explain how that really caused tension. But it's just an example for you, okay? So hopefully now you feel like you can have a go yourself, and you can have a go at writing this particular question. 3 paragraphs, causes, events, outcomes. Take about 12-13 minutes on this in the exam for purposes of, you know, practice. Maybe give yourself 15 or so you have some real time here. My suggestion would be to plan it out first in a way similar to how I showed you. But this really should be one of those questions which is easy and one of the nicer questions on the paper, really, because it's just knowledge recall. Putting on a page what you know in your head, not really a huge amount of skill there. You don't have to analyze the source. You don't have to think about change over time, really. You're just thinking about an event and how that event caused tension.